What's up, everybody? It's George Gabriel, and we're going to make Logic horns sound awesome. So Logic horns come in a couple different ways. They come as sampler instruments, and that's more for the orchestral side of things. And they come as studio horns, which can be used for orchestral, but they're also really handy for non-orchestral like jazz or sports or anything like that. For the purposes of this video, we're going to be focusing on the orchestral aspect, and therefore we'll be using the Logic sampler horns as well as the studio horns to make our point. So let's take a look. Okay, so we're in Logic here, and I did a little piece, literally took me 15 minutes, so don't judge the compositional aspect of it, but really what I'm using is studio horns, and I'm using the Logic samples to give you kind of an orchestral idea here. Now, the beginning, it's more like a single instrument thing, and then later on, it comes into like multiple horns doing their thing. So let's listen to that, but also note that I did put orchestral kit and timpani single strokes in here, which are stock Logic samples, just to kind of illustrate the oomph behind it, because really what you're going to do is when you're making an orchestral piece like this, you're going to put percussion, you're going to put strings behind it and other things as well. So here you go. Again, not my best work, but it gives you an idea on how you can put these things together. Now, I will say that French horns and trombones are kind of in the same sort of family. It's the lower, more bold, more bravado horns. And then you've got the bass horns. In this case, there's not a lot of sampler elements on that. And really, there's not a lot of studio horns elements on that. So I modified a bass trombone, and I modified the tuba solo legato and added some stuff to kind of give it more of that low brass sound. As far as the trumpets are concerned, I use both the legato and staccato sampler, and I use the studio horns, 3 different trumpets, because they're slightly different sounds, and spread them out. But really, when I'm putting the trumpets and trombones and all that together, I like to bust the trombones and French horns together, and I like to have the higher horns, the trumpets in this case, bust on their own bus, so that way I can ride the top end a little bit more with the trumpets. Honestly, you should do the same with the bass trombone and the tuba solo, but in this case, I just added them to the French horn and trombones bus. But when we start looking at this, we are going to look at the French horn. Let me share with you what I did with the French horn. First of all, I used the French horn sampler, French horns legato, and that is just a sustained French horn performance. And then I added a compressor onto that, as well as some EQ onto that. And the reason why I did that is the compressor is meant to glue it together a little bit, and the EQ is meant to just give a little goose around 2500 where the horn speaks and give it a little bit more speaking room at that frequency. One other thing I did on all of these horns is I put them in the same room. I used a Space Designer plugin, and basically I used fine haul, but then I lowered the length of the haul because the fine haul was too long, and I put a little pre-delay. Why I like to put pre-delay on horns is because horns can be really loud, and I like the reflection of the room, so I like it to kind of slap back a little bit, so I put a little bit of a pre-delay on that. So that is kind of a note for all the horns, but I want to kind of A-B the difference between what I did with this versus the horn as it comes. So I'm going to pull up the French horn legato so you can see the difference between the stock version and what I did to modify this a little bit. Honestly, since they've updated the multi-sampler, I like it a little bit less. It's a little bit harder to get around. Be that as it may, I did a couple modifications. So if we're just listening to the French horns Logic legato as it is out of the gate, this is what it sounds like. One of the things that it does is the attack's a little wonky, and the release is also wonky. So in the modification of that, I went from what's ADSR in the standard and I changed it to AHDSR because French horns are going to naturally, they're air, there's somebody's lungs there. So they're naturally going to fall a little bit. And changing it to AHDSR, that is attack, hold, decay, sustain, and release, I put about 1,000 milliseconds, which is 1 second, of a hold before the decay comes in. And the decay is about another 2.5 seconds. And then the sustain, in this case I did 71%, but you could go drastic, so let's just hear the difference. Now you'll hear the horn start to fall a little bit. Now you could go a little bit more drastic on the sustain here. And you hear the level kind of coming down. If you went really drastic, this is what it would do. So really, in the way that you're composing a song, you might modify this differently per song because you might want that decay to happen a little bit lower. But the reason why I did it more subtly is because I'm trying to use other elements to add that decay. So you'll notice I put the mod wheel on the volume. Now this didn't really do exactly what I wanted to do, but if you go to the second little source and I go to mod wheel and I go to volume as my target, what I did was I took the volume down to -16 and then I took the amount up so that little orange thing went all the way to the end. And so now when I use the mod wheel, it's pretty subtle what it does there. The idea behind this is when I'm using lower velocities to have the mod wheel cranked. And then when I lean into it, I take it back down. Furthermore, what I did on this is I thought, horns, they're brass, so they have this brassy sound to it. So on the pitch bend, I assigned the filter drive. So in order to do that, you've got to turn the filter on. And I put the drive up around 38% or something like that. And then I told the pitch bend to, hey, when I bring you in, again, I'm bringing the orange all the way out. So now if I use the pitch bend, you can hear that drive come in and give you a little bit more of that brassy sound. The other added thing to this is when you take the pitch wheel lower, it takes some of the volume out. So when you ride both the mod wheel and the pitch bend wheel together, you can get a little bit more dynamics out of it. So now I have a little bit more play on this, just using those two wheels together, and it gives me a little bit more dynamics. Now I'll take the stock Logic plugin out and go back out to my original plugin that I modified. And you can hear it now with the compressor and the channel EQ and with the reverb on it. So riding both of those gives me a little bit more dynamic. So just gives me a little bit more play, and it gives that sound. Now you'll notice that these are slightly panned to the right. I use the same technique on the trombones. Really, if I were to pull up the trombone, you can see some of the same moves, but again, you have to kind of custom tailor that sample to what it really works with as far as the envelope on that. Again, I used the AHDSR, so it did have a little bit of a fall, and I did the same things with the filter and the volume. When you bring these two together, again, riding both those wheels, it gives me a little bit more dynamic. So and so if I'm doing like, so just gives it a little bit more dynamics, gives it a little bit more play, and You'll notice that I actually add a little bit more release in the trombone because I didn't really like the way the trombone's release was. So it's really a combination of messing with the AHDSR to get a little bit of a natural fall, also to make sure the sample doesn't tail off too quickly. One of the things that I did with the strings in the string video was to add a staccato when you're really leaning into the sample. What it does is it gives that initial blast on the horn. They're going tight, they're going, you know, so you kind of want to add a little staccato, but you have to balance the staccato when it comes in. So looking at the French horn, if I just hit the staccato, you'll notice on a low velocity, if you're looking at my thing here, it doesn't come in, but when I hit a hard velocity, it comes in. I put a velocity limit of 112. So now when I'm hitting those longer loud horns, I'm getting a little bit of blast of staccato with it. So it gives a little bit more of that. Now you have to get the balance between the legato and the staccato. So right now the balance seems a little bit, you almost hear the staccato a little bit more, so you might want to turn up your volume to the legato or turn down your staccato to get that balance together. So when you lean into it a little bit more, those staccatos come in. Same with the trombone. So let's take a look at that. I had the velocity limit coming at 102. Let's just listen to the trombone staccato. So that just gives it a little bit more punch. I like to do that with the two of those together. So now if we're going to take all four of these puppies together, so you can see the dynamics there a little bit. Now, I'm not even using the mod wheel on that. So when you use all those together, how do you do that? How do you play? And, you know, especially if you're doing that and do the mod wheels, typically I'll play the parts first and then I'll address the mod wheels and the pitch bend later for the dynamics. Now, I did add one trombone here from the horns. Now, these are a little interesting because sometimes they like to default back to, I have sustain here, but then it goes to expressive medium. I don't know why it does that, but it does sometimes. So now I'm adding this one. Now, one thing you can do if you want to get some of that low is you can extended key range. So when you get the lowers, it'll just take that sample down lower. I tend to take out the vibrato because really these horns can be great for jazz or for like sports horns or something like that. The vibrato is a little bit too much for an orchestral thing. And so basically I take the vibrato controller off on this, and I do like to extend the range because I do want the trombone to go lower. So when you start layering both of these things in, that gives it a nice balance between the sampled horns and the studio horns, which are also samples. But anyway, it just gives another element to it. There is no French horn in the studio horns, so I couldn't do the same thing with the French horns. But now when I take these together, so again, a little bit more dynamics there. And if I'm using that mod wheel, and if I'm using both it, so just riding both of those wheels together, and it gives it a little bit more dynamics. Moving on to the bass trombone and the tuba solo. Honestly, neither one of these are great samples, but the bass trombone is a better sample because it comes from the studio horns, which in general are better samples, but again, not necessarily meant for orchestral. So let me just take the vibrato controller off on this. So I wanted to get that low horn, like brassy, like nasty sound, and it really wasn't doing the trick. So what I did is I also didn't have enough low end. I put an EQ on it to really boost the low end and boost the brassiness of it. And then beyond that, I also threw a distortion drive on it. And the tone is at 10,000 Hertz or 10K, and the drive is at 18.5. So if I take this out, see, it doesn't have the same impact. When I put it in, it gives it more of that brassy sound that you want. And I have that pan fairly to the left because I want some nice stereo balance out of my horns. If we go to the tuba solo, it's really not that great of a sample either. So I used the tuba solo again, did the 80 HSR on that to modify that. And I did the same drive. Instead of putting it on a wheel, I just put the drive on and I put some resonance on it. And therefore I try to give it a little bit more of that brassy sound. Furthermore, I put overdrive on it. So without the overdrive, and with the overdrive. So when you get these two together, you try to emulate that kind of big, brassy, low end thing. Now you'll notice the bass trombone has already gone to the expressive medium. I don't know why this does this. I don't know if this is just a bug in it. There we go. So when you get those two together, you kind of can emulate that thing. You probably can get a little bit more high end out of it, but really it's not the perfect solution, but at least it kind of emulates that. And that's how I put those things together. Finally, we have the trumpet. Now, I love the Studio Horns trumpet as far as a solo trumpet instrument, especially in the legato mono thing, because you really have some nice sounds here. When it does the legato thing, it almost kind of swells up. It's really nice, almost like a tiny bit of portamento there. Now, the thing with this is really all I have is using that stock horn, trumpet, monophonic, sustain, vibrato control off. I don't want the vibrato happening. And the thing that it does have here is the mod wheel is built into this. So if you want to play it lightly, you make sure your mod wheel's all the way down. Now, that is great for doing those solo lines. And again, same kind of reverb on it, gives it that orchestral reverb. And when you're riding that mod wheel, it gives you a nice solo horn thing. But if you're going to do horns on a bigger blast with multiple horns, you can see I have Trumpet 2 and Trumpet 3. Trumpet 2 is just a different sample, but this I opted to do. It's a little bit more. So I do like the dynamics control on this. Again, mod wheel gives it that volume dynamic, and it also changed the samples a little bit. So that's a nice little add there, and it's a different sample. And then when you add that third horn in, again, with the dynamic control. Now, if I put both of these together, you kind of get a wider sound. So I have one pan to the left, I have one pan to the right at 1030 and 130. So So if you want to do the staccato thing, you're going to have to ride these horns on the mod wheel all the way, because it doesn't really work if the mod wheel is all the way down. But really, when you're writing horns, don't just like write them all at the same time. We're just going to hit everything. And that's why I don't really like the all horn patches, because to get that real sound, you need to kind of custom tailor the areas on where you're going to make the horns work. If you want to do a polyphonic horn, really what you want to do is get multiple samples going and spread them out a little bit to give more of a real effect here. So we've got trumpet 3, which is one sample, trumpet 2, which is another sample, and added to this is the trumpet's legato, which is a sampler instrument, again with the AHDSR to give it a little bit of a natural fade here. And let's see what we got here. Now the trumpet's legato sample is a pretty good sample, so when you couple that with the studio horns and spread them out, it gives you a really nice sound. But again, I wouldn't play this with the mono because it's not going to be able to do that. It's going to choose one of the samples and it might not choose the right one. So if you want to have a lead melody line, go ahead and play that monophonic trumpet on the top and maybe give it a little boost of volume. So it's kind of that lead trumpet out there, just doing the one melody line, and use trumpet 2, trumpet 3, and trumpet's legato to do your multiple polyphony of trumpets. You'll notice that I also added the staccato trumpet, which is a sampler instrument. And again, I have the velocity limit coming in at 105. Now, if I take out the studio horns and I just kind of test this and see how my levels are. It's pretty subtle. So you might want to turn that volume up. Again, you're getting the balance between the legatos, and when you hit hard, you get those staccatos coming in to give it a little bit more of that oomph. So when I change to the mixing screen, you can see that I have the French horns and the trombones, and actually the bass trombones, going to the horns 2 bus, which is right here. And I have a multi-pressor. Basically, I just did a fast attack 4-band compressor on that, just to give it a little bit more oomph. And then I put a linear EQ on it, again, goosing the low end and giving it some brass on the top end. And the trumpets are firing up in the horns 1 bus. Same multi-pressor 4-band attack and linear EQ to give a little bit more high end. As far as the low horns are concerned, they are also on horns 2. Now, if I wanted to, I can just kind of option click these puppies over there and put the bass horns on the next available bus, which happens to be hits. And now I can have a little bit control over bass, French horns, trombones, and the trumpets together. And if I want to EQ these a little bit differently or compress them a little bit differently, and maybe I want to try to get even more brassiness out of this, so I might... There we go. So I'm getting a little bit more out of that by adjusting the compressor on it and compressing the high end to get that out of it. But it's important to point out that when you're scoring horns for orchestral purposes using stock Logic plugins, you really have to custom tailor. You have to do a little bit more sound designing. You have to sit and spend some time and actually figure out, like, how can I make this more realistic sounding? How can I mess with the envelope? How can I mess with maybe using some different approaches to the mod wheel, or putting that drive in the filter and marrying it to the pitch bend wheel, just to give me a lot more options for the dynamics of this. We can't all afford the big expensive samples, and frankly, you can do a lot if you just spend a little bit more time sound designing each one of these samples and spreading them out, putting a really good reverb on it. When you're really leaning into it, add those staccatos in, and it gives you a lot more options on how to do more effective horns using Logic. Sometimes you just gotta kind of polish a turd until it's nice. Now, I'm not saying the Logic samples are turds, but let's face it, it comes with Logic. It's a $199 program, and frankly, it's awesome for what you get. But if you just spend a little bit more time sound designing and working it, you can get it to sound almost like those expensive samples without having to break your bank account. So win-win. Now, if you couple this with what we did with the strings on how to make Logic strings sound awesome, and you use some of the great, the orchestral kit is amazing. I think I use it on everything when I'm doing orchestral because there's a lot of good options on the orchestral kit. Timpani, not so much. But again, you have to sound design it. You have to EQ it. You have to compress it. You have to make it work so it sounds like that great sample. It's not going to sound great out of the gate. That's why you have to take the time to put the details in to make it better. So what do you think? Do you think this is a good approach on how to use stock sounds and make them better? I'd like to know. Drop me a comment and we can dialogue about it. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit the subscribe button, click the bell icon to be notified of future videos, and follow me on Instagram at @GGabrielMusic. Until next time, this is George Gabriel Music.